Imagine standing at the edge of a settlement at the first light of dawn, somewhere in the floodplain between two great rivers. The ground beneath your feet is cracked mud, still cool from the night, already beginning to soften as the sun rises behind a thin veil of river haze. Around you, the settlement stirs. Cooking fires exhale pale threads of smoke. The smell of the marsh drifts in from the east, green and thick, carrying the rot of still water and the thin, sharp scent of fish drying on reed frames. Children move between low, mud brick structures, their feet dark with the same earth that built the walls around them. This is not the dawn of a mythological world. This is the dawn of our world. The actual, physical, sweat-stained foundation of everything that came after. And it was stranger, harder, and more layered with meaning than anything we tend to imagine when we think of the ancient past. We are in the late Ubaid period, pressing into what archaeologists call the early Uruk phase, roughly 4000 BC. The region we now call southern Mesopotamia, straddling modern Iraq, is home to some of the densest concentrations of human settlement the world has yet seen. Sites like Eridu, the city that Sumerian tradition identifies as the oldest city on Earth, have been inhabited for centuries already. The population of the floodplain is growing, fed by increasingly sophisticated irrigation canals that draw water from the Euphrates and Tigris into fields of emmer wheat and barley. Cattle, goats, and sheep move in herds across the margins of cultivated land. The infrastructure of early civilization is assembling itself slowly, not by design, but by the accumulated pressure of necessity. And yet, woven into this material reality, there exists a framework of belief that shapes how the people of this era understand what they see around them. Ancient texts preserved much later in Sumerian and Akkadian tradition speak of a time before the Great Flood, a primordial age when the world was governed by beings of extraordinary power and presence. The Hebrew tradition, drawing on older streams of oral memory, would eventually record in Genesis that in those days there were Nephilim on the earth, described as the offspring of the sons of God and the daughters of men, figures of great renown. The Book of Enoch, or a text cherished in certain Jewish and early Christian communities and dated in its earliest layers to perhaps the 3rd or 2nd century BC, but believed to transmit far older oral material, elaborates an entire cosmology around these beings. Their descent, their teaching of forbidden knowledge to humanity, their disruption of the natural order. We cannot treat these accounts as literal archaeology, but we also cannot dismiss them as mere fantasy. The people living in the floodplain in 4000 BC were themselves heirs to oral traditions that stretched back into deep time. Stories that attempted to explain why the world was the way it was, why some men seemed larger than life, why civilization appeared so suddenly from the mud, why the rivers sometimes rose and swallowed everything. These traditions matter not because they confirm or deny what we find in the excavation trenches, but because they are the interior architecture of the ancient mind. The framework through which daily life was interpreted, endured, and passed on. With that in mind, consider who actually lived in these settlements and how power moved between them. Social stratification in the late Ubaid and early Uruk periods was already pronounced, though it was organized around different axes than what we might expect. The temple dominated. At Eridu, archaeologists uncovered a sequence of superimposed temple structures dating back to roughly 5500 BC. Each one built on the foundations of the last, each one slightly larger, slightly more elaborate. By 4000 BC, the temple at settlements like this was not simply a place of worship. It was an administrative center, a granary, a redistribution hub. The priests who served it were simultaneously religious officiants and economic managers. They received offerings of grain, oil, and livestock. They oversaw the allocation of resources to laborers and craftsmen. The ledgers they kept, scratched at first into clay tokens and later into the earliest forms of proto-writing, were not prayers. They were receipts. This concentration of wealth and authority around the temple complex created a visible hierarchy that anyone moving through the settlement could read at a glance. The temple itself stood elevated on a platform, visible from the surrounding fields. The residences of those who served the temple directly, the senior administrators, the high priests, the overseers of irrigation works, were larger, built with more careful attention to drainage and internal space. They had access to better food, to imported goods carried by river traders from the mountains to the north, to copper tools that most families would never touch. Below them stretched a much larger population of farmers, herders, fishermen, and laborers whose lives were governed by the rhythm of planting, flooding, harvest, and the constant negotiation between what the land gave and what it withheld. The laborers who maintained the irrigation canals occupied a curious social position. Their work was essential, literally foundational to the survival of everyone above them in the hierarchy. And yet, it left no monuments, no named records, no legacy beyond the channels themselves. We know they existed because the channels exist, because the agricultural yields of this period required a level of coordinated labor that no individual family could provide. The organizational logic that assembled these labor forces was almost certainly tied to the temple system, which means that the first large-scale collective labor in human history was mobilized not by a king with an army, but by a religious institution with grain stores. The people working in the mud at the edge of the canal were not slaves in the chattel sense, but they were bound by debt, by obligation, by the social weight of a system that had no word yet for what they were. A day in the life of one of these families would begin before sunrise. The family sleeping space was a single room, or perhaps two. The walls of mud brick still cool at night, but absorbing the heat ferociously as the day progressed, until by afternoon the interior was an oven. There was no chimney. Cooking fires inside filled rooms with smoke, which explains the high rates of respiratory pathology visible in skeletal remains from this period, including lesions consistent with chronic sinusitis and inflammation of the airways. Most cooking happened outside or in a partially open courtyard. Bread baked on clay griddles, flatbread pressed from emmer wheat ground by hand on stone saddle querns, a labor so physically demanding that the skeletons of women from this period show pronounced degenerative changes in their knees, hips, and lower vertebrae. The physical cost of a daily task, invisible in any written record, but perfectly preserved in bone. Water came from the river or the canal, and it was not clean. Isotopic and paleoparasitological studies of human remains and sediment layers from Mesopotamian sites have confirmed the presence of intestinal parasites, including roundworm, whipworm, and liver fluke in populations throughout this period. Waterborne illness was endemic. Infant and child mortality was catastrophic by modern standards, with some estimates suggesting that half of all children born in this era did not survive to adulthood. The grief this implies is almost too large to hold. Every family and every settlement was shaped by loss in a way that has no direct modern equivalent in the developed world. Death was not an interruption to daily life. It was a texture woven through it. And yet people managed. They developed medicinal practices rooted in empirical observation, even if they understood those observations through a supernatural lens. Plant materials with genuine analgesic and antimicrobial properties, including willow bark, garlic, and various marsh herbs, were used in ways that anticipate later documented Mesopotamian medical traditions. The healer in a community of this period occupied a social role adjacent to the priestly class, someone who moved between the visible world of the body and the invisible world of divine causation. Because in this framework, illness was not simply biological dysfunction, it was a message, a punishment, a disruption of right relationship between the human community and the forces governing the world. Those forces, in the belief system of the era, were not abstract. They were present, named, and demanding. Sumerian theological tradition, one which crystallizes the religious sensibility of this period, even if the texts themselves were committed to writing later, describes a cosmos managed by a complex assembly of divine beings whose decisions shaped everything from weather to individual fate. The temple was the dwelling place of the god of the city, and the rituals performed there were not symbolic. They were functional. They fed the god, clothed the god, entertained the god, and in return the god was expected to advocate for the community before the higher divine assembly. When the floods came too early, or the rains failed, or disease moved through the settlement like a shadow, the explanation was relational. Something had disturbed the divine order. Some obligation had been neglected. Some boundary had been crossed. Into this landscape of managed devotion and precarious survival, the traditions around figures like the Nephilim insert a haunting question. If the texts are read not as literal record, but as cultural memory, they describe a period when the boundary between the human and the divine was experienced as permeable, when certain individuals or lineages carried an authority that seemed to exceed normal human proportion. The Sumerian king list, one of the most remarkable documents of early antiquity, records the pre-flood rulers of cities like Eridu and Bad Tibira as having reigned for impossibly long periods, tens of thousands of years, numbers that are obviously not meant as literal chronology, but that encode something about how the ancient mind conceived of a primordial age of greater divine proximity. These were not ordinary men in the tradition's own understanding. They were something else, something between. Whether we read this as mythology, as encoded memory of dominant lineages or priestly dynasties, or simply as the human need to explain the incomprehensible complexity of early civilization by invoking supernatural agency, the social effect was real. The hierarchy of the settlement was not merely economic, it was cosmological. The family grinding grain before dawn did so within a system in which the distance between them and the temple administrator above them was understood as reflecting something about the nature of reality itself. Power was not arbitrary. It was divinely structured. To challenge it was not simply to challenge a person. It was to challenge the order of the universe. This does not mean the ancient poor were passive. Archaeology preserves evidence of tension, of fires that may have been deliberate, of redistribution systems that appear to have periodically broken down, of communities that simply moved when conditions became intolerable. The mobility of these populations is easy to underestimate. People walked. They followed water. They relocated when a settlement grew too crowded or too sick or too demanding. The rivers themselves were highways, carrying traders, refugees, and ideas between communities separated by hundreds of kilometers. A copper bead found in a settlement near Eridu might have begun its life in the mountains of Anatolia. A trade good from the Zagros foothills might sit in a storage jar in a household on the Mesopotamian plain. The world of 4000 BC was not sealed. It breathed. What was sealed, or what was in the process of being sealed, was the social logic that would eventually produce the first true cities, the mechanisms that concentrated surplus, that directed labor, that bound communities to a place through the weight of investment in irrigation infrastructure and temple maintenance. These were the same mechanisms that would, within a few centuries, produce Uruk as one of the first urban centers in human history, home to perhaps 40 or 50,000 people by 3500 BC. So everything that made that possible was already present in embryonic form in the settlement at the edge of the canal in 4000 BC. The accounting systems, the labor organization, the theological justification for inequality, the specialization of craft and administration, it was all there, operating in mud and reed and unbaked clay. You can go to southern Iraq today, if conditions permit, and stand at Tel El Ubaid or at the mound of ancient Eridu and feel the ground change texture under your feet. The soil in these places has a particular quality, compact and pale, marked by the compressed remains of thousands of years of human presence. Pottery fragments emerge from eroded edges of the Tel. The air still smells of the river. The date palms that shade the site were here in some ancestral form, when the people we have been describing were alive. They harvested dates from trees like these. They used the fronds to thatch their roofs. Now they watched the same slow river carry the same silt toward the same distant sea. What we will never recover is the sound of it. The particular cry of a child waking sick in the night in a mud brick house 6,000 years gone. The specific prayer murmured by a woman kneeling in the courtyard of a temple, whose name we have not yet excavated. The conversation between two laborers sitting at the edge of a canal at midday, resting their backs, looking at the sky. This is the permanent loss of history, not the objects, which the earth preserves with surprising fidelity, but the interior life, the texture of consciousness in a world that understood itself so differently from ours that the distance between us is harder to cross than any ocean. And yet we try. Because these people are not strangers. They are the architects of everything. The grain they planted feeds a line of cultivation that runs unbroken to the present. When the accounting they invented became writing. The canals they dug became the model for every irrigation system on Earth. The hierarchy they lived within became the template for organized power in every civilization that followed. Whatever we make of the Nephilim, whatever we make of the ancient traditions that describe this era as a time of giants and divine proximity and catastrophic disruption, the real miracle is simpler and more durable. People survived. Communities endured. Children grew up in the heat and the mud and the disease and the flood, and they learned, and they passed on what they learned. And here we are. If you have a question about another era you want us to explore, another lost world you want us to reconstruct, leave it below. We are just getting started. We are just